Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. I want to talk about this idea of middle-of-the-road mindfulness, or having enough being in the present moment and being mindful to live a really good quality life without holding yourself to the standard that would go with being a Buddhist practitioner in an ashram, for example. So one of the really powerful things about being in the modern world is the accessibility of some utterly magnificent teachers, and especially with COVID, with their wisdom on demand, but often even before that. So we have people like Pema Chodron or Gangaji who have embodied this really potent, amazing wisdom and live it and share from that place. And it's exquisite. However, they're people who've gone very, very, very deep into these experiences of the present moment and mindfulness. And one of the things that I remember my head getting really loud about early on my journey was that I would access some of this mindfulness thing. I would go sit with a Zen master and meditate and be guided through something, and I would feel this magnificent openness and expansion. And one of the cool things about listening to Pema Chodron speak or sitting with someone who's done this kind of deep, deep meditation practice is they can set the vibrational energy and it wakes up a potential inside of you. So you can kind of fast track, get some of the really cool benefits. But I've always had this really busy, active, dynamic mind. So I'm in entrepreneurship, and while on the introverted side, and I like my own company at home with my cat, I'm also out and about in the world. And I had my head get really loud about this notion that I should achieve some sort of perfectionism of always being mindful and always being super present. And as time has gone by and I wove some of this magnificent wisdom into my day-to-day life, I found a different balance with it. And I want to offer it just in case it's a map that feels more relevant. Because again, I think these profound experts are amazing people to learn from, but their wisdom may not be like, hey, you could put in a little bit of time every day to this and weave it into your normal busy life, and that'd be cool. It would give you a lot of benefit. There's almost this feeling like we need to go on a silent retreat to really, get present with ourselves. So I want to share with you this kind of notion of enough mindfulness and enough practices in place to catch yourself when you need to turn up the volume. So we all have that experience where we're like, I wonder if I'm getting sick. I've got that little tickle in the back of my throat, or maybe some fatigue, or we kind of go inside and track our body. And one of the things I do when I have that feeling is I'm like, okay, I'm going to cut back on sugar, delicious as it is, because I know that is something that's really impactful for my immune system, a lot of people's, but I'll just speak to mine. And I might go take some of my supplements that are really good immune boosters, and I might be extra committed to getting good sleep. And a lot of times something that feels like it has the potential to turn into a head cold ends up going away, which is great. Highly in favor of that. And similarly, I think that there's a level of mindfulness where we check in with ourselves, where we do that same kind of scan that we would do to see how our body's doing. One of the things my massage therapist always asks is, how's the body? And in answering that, I end up checking in with myself. Oh, my neck might be a little stiff, or oh, pretty good, or I have some muscle soreness, or this part of my body's grumpy, or, there's this sort of going inside and doing this diagnostic. And one of the things you may come to that's really useful for you in achieving whatever that level of enough mindfulness is for you is that having a scheduled time with another person who's willing to hear you can be really, really useful. I would say that at this point in my life, I'm not in therapy or trying to heal. I don't feel like I'm wounded or trying to sort of overcome and get to some basic level of psychological and emotional health. I feel like those things are really quite good in terms of my life and my experience. I put a lot of time and work and, did a lot of therapy to get there. But now I still find it really useful to have what I think of as facilitated personal inquiry, where I have somebody that I'm going to see and sitting with and emptying my basket and talking about the things that matter to me and what's happening and what's on my mind and what's on my heart. And it's just a very good time to get present with myself in a particular way. So there's a lot of merit to having something on the schedule. One of the things that I still contend with in the background is that my strategy growing up was I didn't know how to deal with emotions. I had a really super heart-connected mother who didn't necessarily learn how to deal with emotions at that time in her life. I would argue that at this time in her life, she's one of the more emotionally intelligent people I know and magnificent in that regard. But, as a young mother, the bigness of her children's emotions, not so much anger, but if I was really sad and she couldn't soothe me, that was kind of activating for her. So I internalized being extraordinarily sensitive and quite psychic, that this sad thing was bad news. And so I got really good at numbing that. And I had a lot of the overachieving strategies of perfectionism and being the good girl and that sort of thing to navigate the world. And some of them had some useful aspects. And I think they need a measure of adult supervision to make sure they're the most functional strategy in my adult life. So one of the questions I love to ask myself about anything that I'm involved in is, where's the line on what's good enough? What's good enough where doing better than this won't make me appreciably happier or healthier or more balanced? And you can still go above and beyond and be better at something for the pure joy of it or the expression or the exploration. But if you aren't trying to be top of the class with everything, especially if you're not doing it on the stack of a lot of natural talent, you're going to free up a lot of life force energy and time and talent and space for a multi-spectrum engagement with the world. And I think that that's really neat for a lot of us. For sure, there are people who really want to, focus all their attention on one thing, in terms of building a business or, being an Olympic athlete or, there are people who get very, very, very down the rabbit hole with a single passion and objective and commitment. And that's great. And that may be something we do at times in our lives, but I don't think it's necessarily the most fulfilling lifestyle because it seldom speaks to all of our chakras when we're committed to one thing. And for example, if you give up social connection in pursuit of a worthy goal or dream, and you're not getting social connection within that context, you can have loneliness creeping up on you in the background. And the overall happiness in your life may not be as great when you achieve your milestones. So coming back around to this notion of enough mindfulness, I was shown when I had this topic drop in by my guides, they reminded me of the weather up approach to dog training. So despite the fact that you'll see me with pictures of dogs, I don't actually have a dog. I have a kitty cat and I have neighbor dogs, which is just the best. They come to my sliding glass door often and I get to play with them pretty much every day without the responsibility of dog ownership, which highly recommend if you can dial that in. But that being said, growing up, we always had dogs and I absolutely adored growing up with dogs. It was utterly wonderful. And the weather up dogs were trained-ish. So there were some basic things we covered, like the dogs should know the word sit, and we tried to discourage them from jumping on company. And Some of them learned to walk on a leash. Others, there wasn't so much reason for that. But we tended to end up with breeds that were pretty good family dogs. So we had golden retrievers and Australian shepherds and border collie Australian shepherd mixes. So these were really smart dogs, but also, they weren't dogs that were set to be guard dogs. So I want to preface this strategy with the trained enough, doesn't work as well with certain breeds. There are certain breeds that, really do need more training not to be dangerous to people. But our dogs were, benevolently, if they were a certain distance away, might not hear you telling them what to do. And that was okay within the sort of how everything got balanced with the family. So we had some really strict rules. I grew up on a farm, and thou shalt not chase the chickens or the goats or the sheep. There were strong rules about, don't chase the livestock. One of our dogs was cleverly lawyer-like about this absolute, in that she figured out that if she ran in a direction where there happened to be some chickens or goats in her path, and she just ran in a straight line, then she wasn't actually chasing. She was just running in a particular direction, and it couldn't be her fault. So if she didn't curve her path once the, chickens flapped out of her way, she would have essentially plausible deniability, and we could live with that. We're like, it's okay enough. So what I'd like to offer with this, and what the guides were sort of bringing up when they reminded me of this as a possibility, is when it comes to mindfulness, some of the people who teach meditation kind of teach about, training your mind. You have this unruly mind, and it does well with some discipline and structure. And in kind of knowing what that is, how can you have your mind disciplined enough without having to be present with it every moment of the day? Now, there's a completely valid path to try to live completely in the moment and mindfulness. And there are a lot of really great things that come from turning up the volume on how much of that there is. But I think there's also a path of kind of letting your mind do its own thing and providing it with just enough adult supervision that it doesn't run amok. So you want to kind of catch it if you start going down the rabbit hole of comparison and it's creating a lot of tension in your body. I want to, before I go into more of this, I just want to kind of mention, I talk about this in a lot of different things, that there's a lot of the unhealthy, not so helpful, harmful rumination and things that can really happen in our brain that are a result of there being the adrenaline and cortisol in our system that comes with a fight or flight activation. So there's this is your brain on fight or flight chemistry. And there are a lot of tensions that arise in our body when the fight or flight system is activated that make us pay attention to things that what we know is aren't very sustainable. So if we're comparing ourselves to a woman in the magazine that's been photoshopped, or a man in a magazine who's, holding expensive liquor and has, beautiful women hanging on him, advertising really speaks to primal instinctual parts of our brain. So our brains are going to care about status, about being liked. When I work with someone who comes to me and says, I'm a really bad people pleaser, I really want to change that, I don't necessarily know what I want, I say, okay, step number one, let's calm the instincts, because people pleasing is a legitimate hunter-gatherer survival strategy. If the tribe didn't like you and they didn't share food and resources and help to protect you, you would die. Getting thrown out of the tribe was probably a death sentence back in the day. And as such, our instincts are all about survive first, and then you can thrive, and then you can, be self-actualized, and then you can, have, whatever you want to get up to. You can think amazing things or write books or whatever, but first don't die. And so when we feel low level, unsafe or unsettled, a knee-jerk response is to be pleasing and avoid displeasing, especially if you're in a female body and you have that kind of hormones and chemistry. Certainly lots of men follow that strategy as well, but there's this really primal response, and if you calm the fight or flight before you try to wrestle with your pattern of people pleasing, there's still going to be tension, but it will be at a non-debilitating level when you say, hey, I noticed that what you're asking for isn't really a great match for me. Let's see if we can find a win-win. And the challenge with people pleasing is you don't necessarily have the communication skills for that to roll trippingly off the tongue. It's kind of a journey of being able to cough up the truth, even if it's awkward, and then, getting more elegant at doing it. But there's still a deep breath and a moment of acknowledging the tension and being with it when I say the awkward thing. So I talked about in another episode being on a date, and at the end of it, I just took a breath. I knew it wasn't going to be the most fun moment and said, wow, thank you so much for meeting me. I enjoyed the time, but I really don't think we're a match. And then I just stopped talking. I didn't babble. I didn't explain. If he'd wanted to know why I didn't think we were a match, he could have asked questions. And then I just gave him space for his response, which was, a little spiky and a little emotional and a little, let me try to get out of this situation as gracefully as possible. And being able to hold a container for myself first to just be in that kind of tension. So in doing this, enough mindfulness, one of the things that you want to keep track of is my fight or flight activated? And that is a very good thing to get soothed and dropped enough so that this other stuff can layer on top of it. Because again, there's so much inner monologue that turns really terrible that is coming out of instincts. So our instincts are looking for what is perceived social value. And then there can be this monologue in our brain that's comparing ourselves, our weight, our beauty, our charisma, our popularity, constantly to this very idealized standard that is, again, this is your brain on a combination of modern marketing and fight or flight chemistry. And these are really predictable results. I minored in women's studies and did women's groups. And one of the things that really stood out to me is how much the unsupervised inner monologue of women with very different backgrounds ends up being very similar. I find that really interesting, and it's powerful knowledge to have, because then we know that this thing isn't something that is innately a part of us. It's a response to the environment we're in, and it's one that can be overcome. It just needs a certain amount of adult supervision. So coming back to enough mindfulness, I would offer that there's really a lot of value in having a system in place for how do I check in with myself often enough. I remember seeing a shower curtain where you could drop your iPad in so that you could watch a movie while you were showering, and being quite distressed because showering might be one of the few opportunities where we don't have music or a movie or an audiobook or something that's playing in the background that gets in the way of us just seeing what our condition is, just seeing what's bubbling up to the surface. And going back to that early young Katie who really didn't like her emotions and still doesn't, but has learned that no good ever comes of emotional numbing and they aren't as bad as I think they are. And, if I were doing sticky notes, I would have that on a sticky note, because I can slip into a pattern of having a lot longer duration trying to numb out what's actually a very moderate emotion. And so when I'm on my game, I have my finger on the pulse of some things. What's rumbling in terms of my emotionality? Okay, I might be hanging with grief today for no reason I could discern. Okay, but I'm just going to hold it and stay present to us. There's a book called Anger by Thich Nhat Hanh that's really beautiful about this notion. He's talking about anger, but you could apply it to any emotion of just, getting on with your life while staying present and holding those emotions. Very quick read, very beautiful wisdom. And I think that some of these people who have devoted their lives to going really deeply into this path and having it be something that permeates every aspect of their life can bring back wisdom from the territory. So I'm a huge fan of all these magnificent, living masters of this kind of knowledge. I just know that for a lot of us, we may end up comparing ourselves and feeling like we can never do enough because they don't necessarily detail a path that says, okay, that's enough mindfulness. But it's good to have a way of saying, how's my fight or flight doing? You don't want it to run amok and fill your body with chemistry, hammering away in the background without noticing. I talk a lot about this in my podcast on anxiety. And similarly, we don't want our mind to be influenced into comparisons and perceived social value and popularity. These things don't really make us happy, but we think they will because of how much our instincts are associating them with something that would have been good for hunter-gatherer survival. So our brains are these really amazing, but also really wacky, pieces of hardware and software with all these parts. And understanding a bit about neuroscience, I think, is really useful. So we can say, oh, my executive brain isn't online. All right, let me calm myself down enough to get my thinking brain online before I start trying to problem solve a complicated problem. There's a self-diagnosis that I would say goes with enough mindfulness where you know when things are starting to spin out. And if you're spun out all the time, I would offer that making that a really serious front of mind project to work on. How do I get my anxiety under control? The shorter amount of time that you just endure it because you haven't found the secret sauce, I think will do you a lot of favors. And I would really invite growth mindset because it's hard. One of the things I start a lot of my programs with in my academy is why your mind is lying to you when it says this will never work. Because our brains are always trying to save calories. So if we've tried a bunch of things and they haven't worked, our brain is like, hey, don't go wasting any more calories on that. Food is scarce. But most of us have food security, so we don't need to run our brain in power saving mode. We can dive into committing ourselves to being all in with research and development to solve really important problems without risking our survival because we've blown through too many calories. So going broader on this, I talked about anxiety, but this could be anything: perfectionism, comparison. If that really has its teeth in you, you might want to do some really focused therapy to work with that. You may want to really dive into that and get that cleaned up enough so that you know what to say to yourself when your brain starts to tell you lies, like you have to be perfect to be loved, and this is how you'll create safety in the world. When we say it out loud and we really examine and question that, it quickly is revealed as not a very sound principle, but it lives inside of a lot of people, especially people who were in a measure of stress state growing up for one reason or another. So I would offer that when we're looking at mindfulness, we want to create opportunities throughout the day where we get present with ourselves enough to check in with ourselves. So ideally, if we've diagnosed a really chronic problem that's really leaking away our happiness, like a, unresolved trauma or pain, it is good to, consistently work with someone and get the help and support to up-level that. But for a lot of people, they've done that inner work. So it's more about the, making your life more elegant, increasing your happiness. And a lot of that is an internal job. I am in the interesting place of having a life that is really good at the level of circumstance. So if I'm having a bad day, it's probably something about how I'm talking to myself or what is going on inside of me, which is cool and annoying in equal measure, I would say. I wouldn't want to change it. It's a good problem to have, but I don't necessarily have a lot of fantasies. If only I could change the circumstance, I would be so much happier. If only this thing, were different in my life. So once you get to a reasonable level of emotional and psychological health, and of course I would add in energetic health. I find that therapy is very limited for a lot of energetically sensitive psychic people because it doesn't teach them how to have a healthy energy body and how to diagnose and troubleshoot that and how to work with it. I wish that the therapeutic model wasn't putting psychological and emotional health in a completely different space than the energetic side of things. So, of course, in my work, I'm looking at all of those together and how they interact with each other. So, therapy can be quite incomplete for those of us who are energetically sensitive, and the person who's right for you for ongoing proactive support may well be someone who's good at reading energy. So the person that I work with is absolutely tracking what are my chakras up to as I talk about emptying my basket of where I got hooked or where my head got a little loud. And sometimes you have really good friendships where you can take turns really emptying your basket, like what's on my mind. And if you're seeing that person regularly or talking to them regularly, that can be a great place if you feel like you aren't filtering or holding back or needing to put on a particular mask and there's a real sense of openness. That can be really good. If you haven't had as many of those opportunities, finding a safe person who offers that in a professional energy exchange can be really, really helpful. So a good therapist, I do work along those lines with people. I love when I get to support someone that way. But having someone who can witness you in a set time and space to really look at what's crunchy before it gets really loud. Because the thing about emotional numbing is a lot of us do it unconsciously. And I'm all for playing solitaire if you want for chunks of time or binging Netflix or curling up with a good book. I need those kind of times in contrast to how vibrantly my mind works at other times. I do really well with the intensity of shamanic work, really present connections with other people, some mindless time washing the dishes and listening to an audiobook, some movement for my body. There are all these different things, and time curled up with a good book where I'm not trying to learn anything, and it sort of pulls my awareness from all the different ways it flows. And so one of the things about the female brain is we have diffuse awareness, which means it flows in all directions. We can be, doing one thing and have an inner monologue and keeping track of another. It's a really different wiring of the brain compared to the male brain, which tends to be single focus. And again, mileage can vary by people. If you've incarnated in the other gender a lot of lifetimes and you're trying something different in this lifetime, your brain could certainly work the other way. But as a general rule, part of what's really useful for reading at night is it pulls my awareness in. So all of my, all right, I don't want to leak energy to what's going on in the Ukraine and, I need to remember to send that follow-up email. And all those ways my brain bounces around, which is fine during the day, but bad for going to sleep. It pulls my awareness in. So I find that it's really good. It works really nicely to read a book in the evening. But if we're numbing something, we can move to drown out what we're feeling without it ever crossing into our conscious awareness. So we can end up over binging Netflix or over losing ourselves in book after book after book, or reaching for sugar without even thinking about it, or compulsively checking Facebook to see who's admiring us, or excessive online shopping for the chemistry boost. There are just a lot of ways that we can hack our chemistry before we've even thought about it. And the trouble is that if we're sustaining something, those chemistry hits tend to have a crash on the other side. So there's a little bit more of an emotional roller coaster. And I've pretty much accepted that how I feel from moment to moment is going to be a moving target. There are going to be ups and downs and highs and lows. And some days I'm going to have really expansive energy, and some days my energy is going to be more pulled in. And that's just the nature of being me. And I wish I had more predictable or sustainable energy, but that's just not the case. However, what I find is that as I've gotten healthier and more balanced, the amplitude, this is my engineering geek showing up, which basically means how high and how low something goes, is much smaller. It stays for the most part within a much more moderate high and low swing, which is much more manageable. It's really taxing and exhausting when we're going to the really high highs and the really low lows and swinging back and forth. And so part of what comes out of all of this is, just it's a moving target, but it's not, it's a moving target that's a 3 or a 4 on a scale of 1 to 10. You're not like an 8 elated and an 8 depressed, in the space of a few days or a few weeks, barring activating events. So this doesn't apply if you've just had a death in the family or someone in the hospital or a diagnosis or things like that. So certainly there's a place for big emotions, but the more that we are setting up systems, and that's part of where having a therapist that you're seeing every week or a really good facilitator. I love it when people just book regular sessions with me and we can just dive into what's alive for them. Like there's so much cool, subtle healing work when someone doesn't come in with a really big pain point, but they're coming in with wow, let's see what got a little crunchy and keep optimizing my life. I love getting to work with people in that mode. And that's really how I use the facilitation that I get. So I just want to offer this, and what system you come up with could be, reminders in your phone. Okay, 5 minutes at 6 o'clock to, take some deep breaths and, journal for 5 minutes about what am I feeling? Or, there can be all these ways that you work in, hey, how do I keep track of what my fight or flight is up to? How do I notice when I start reaching for more sugar or whatever your numbing strategy of choice is? How do I catch myself? Because a lot of us have a lot of skills, a lot of different practices, a lot of things that we can, pull off the shelf, but only if we get our time and attention focused on troubleshooting and addressing what's going on. So if I'm sitting on some emotion or some grief, I need to kind of override some really strong blocks to allowing myself to cry out of emotionality. And it's very much a conscious like, oh, I've gotten really tired for no appreciable reason. So I check with other things like, hey, am I in my body? Did I go off somewhere else? And am I grounded? And, they're energetic check-ins. But sometimes I'll get really tired because I'm pushing down emotion, and that takes a ton of energy. And I'm like, oh, I just need to release some of those blocks and cry my eyes out. And it moves really fast. For me, I've done a lot of cleaning up of emotional debt. So it could be as fast as 2 or 3 minutes of that. And at the end, I'm like, wow, I was fighting that like crazy. That wasn't even that bad, and it's kind of a funny thing to allow those things to move. So what I want to offer for you is starting to think about a system, because the more you need to check in with yourself and employ a little more mindfulness, the more your system's going to try to protect you from feeling feelings. I really don't understand why our fight or flight instinct system has decided that emotionality is a terrible threat and we should be protected from it at all costs, and, is reaching for something else. You see this behavior in really, really young children. The more emotionally intense the day has been, the more they're begging for a cookie at the grocery store. But I think that this is a great way to take some of the wisdom from the amazing masters that we have access to and work their teaching into something more balanced. So we aren't making ourselves a failure for not being present in the present moment every moment that we're awake. We can lean into that, we can hang with the present moment, and we can, tend to amplify that, and we can notice, that it's great. There's a lot of really, really good stuff that comes out of that. But we can also allow ourselves to have those relaxed brain autopilot times. We just want to notice if we're getting into rumination, if we're arguing in our head with someone, if we're remembering a slight against us and, arguing with the reality that the person did that thing to us and that's so wrong and how could somebody act like that. All of those things really produce a lot of stress chemistry. And granted, if it's a recent event, it may be on your mind while you sort through it. But if it's years ago and your brain just pops up a remembered offense, you probably want to try to notice and do something like the transmutation breath, where you breathe the energy into your heart chakra and exhale neutrality, so you could let go of holding on to that thing rather than having a big old argument with somebody who behaved badly years ago and isn't even in your life. I can kind of understand that. The brain's like, so you got hurt, let's strategize how you would protect yourself. And so we come up with the most cutting, devastating speech or the way that we could have responded, and that can provide relief. But there's a faster pathway through if we don't get our mind quite so involved. So if you're ruminating, if you're comparing, if you're into perfectionism, if your numbing strategies are up, if you're doing a lot of things that aren't very good for you for the chemistry hit, you could say like, let me troubleshoot. Do I have a deeper problem? Do I really need to put more structured support into my life and make my mental and emotional and energetic health a higher priority? That might be the case. Or am I fundamentally okay, but I've just kind of slipped into some old patterning. And so do I just need to turn the volume dial up a little bit so that I release some of the tension that's building up and the emotional numbing comes back down to a lower level, and then I can go back to bebopping around. And I just wanted to offer this because, again, I think we have a culture that does a lot of all or nothing. Be the top of your class, be the best at this. And there are a lot of cool things where we're like, yeah, that's a neat tool. I think I'll throw some of that in. And we can play with diversity. We can be like, all right, I'm going to do more qigong this week, or I'm going to do some journaling this week, or there are just so many practices. And a lot of us get overwhelmed by practices, and daily practices are wonderful. But I'll be honest, I don't have a lot of daily practices. My daily practices actually center around exercise goals. I want to do 3 strength training exercises in the kitchen and 4 neck exercises. They're not, okay, I'm going to meditate for 20 minutes, but there are these reflective times when I'm in the shower. I check in with myself often. I'm scanning, hey, what's going on? How am I doing? I have friends that I have deep conversations with. I sit in the hot tub without the bubbles on or any music and look at the stars and just hang with myself. And these are all things that seem to be enough mindfulness that I can kind of let my brain go in other ways without needing to be super trained. And if I get into some of that comparison or rumination, or, I should really lose weight when there's not really a medical reason to do so and it's getting loud, I can kind of redirect myself. I can catch it and I can redirect myself, and I can rebalance in a way that gives me a lot of opportunity to just catch it before it gets too out of hand. So it doesn't have to be this all or nothing, because there's a time in my day where the popcorn style, what about this and what about this, and remember to do this and this would be great to weave in, actually leaves me really efficient. And there are other times when it should be turned off. And sometimes a show is a better way to do that. For the podcast, I open up all these channels to receive information from the guides about what am I going to say next? What am I going to say next? And when I stop recording, because my voice is tired and I need to do some other things, and it's a balanced life, a lot of times the next podcast, those inspiration channels are still really open, and I need to close them down. I need to be like, that's awesome. Hold that thought. If I have a topic that drops in fully formed when I'm done recording, I write it down so I can come back to it at another time. But there's this awareness of being able to have my brain obey me enough to be able to have it be obedient and cooperative and in collaboration with me and trusting me to direct it and appropriate enough. And then for the rest, I just kind of let it bebop around and do its thing. And that seems to work really well for me. And it may have changed over the years. I did a lot of my training and, I'm much more of a content creator than consumer, other than for my guides. I'm very constantly in conversation with my guides and a few people, but there may be more balanced wisdom out there. But certainly when I was learning about all of this stuff, it was something that left me feeling like I wasn't good enough if I didn't keep being better and better and better at this. And I found that that wasn't the most useful for me. So I hope that somewhere in all of this rambling and all of these possibilities, there's something that sparks for you in a way that's useful. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.